Okay, so just to introduce the format of the presentation, the presentation is kind of broken up into three particular areas. One is the context, and Robert is going to outline.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I think maybe a little bit of a glitch at the very beginning between myself and Bob, but yeah, this is Robert Burns here.
Robert, we're just having some issue with the audio. Would you be able to just turn off the video just for a second, just in case there's some connectivity issues? Thanks a million. Okay. So, oh God, we've lost Robert altogether. Right. Oh, there we are. So Robert, if we're not able to pick you up, Bob, would you be able to take over?
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Great, thanks a million.
yeah. Okay, so I'll run on with this. So it's called The Art of the Possible, and it's the Coastal Mobility Route project. So the format of the presentation is that it's split into, as I was saying, into three areas: the context, the design approach, and the delivery. And if we can get Robert back, he would be talking about the context in which this project first came into being. Obviously, it's a project that was undertaken during the COVID period, and it'll just outline the various challenges and DLR's approach to the what was going on at that particular time. Then what I was going to do is to go into the design approach and to talk about, I suppose, the in-house resource through DLR architects, the coastal route in terms of its development, in terms of policy and where it sits in our existing county development plan, and then move through ideas of placemaking concepts, and then bringing that through the actual evolution of our own approach to project delivery. Then Conor will actually go through the actual delivery itself, and then we will go through some of the elements of the actual project itself, just explaining in detail some of the design elements. Finally, rounding around to the evaluation that we're going to undertake. So I don't think Robert's back in from what I can see, so I'm just gonna knock on.
So, Robert, can you turn off your, just click the stop video icon over in the bottom left-hand corner, and then see if we, yeah, perfect, and then just see what your audio is like then. Thanks a million.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay.
Sorry, that's much better, thanks a million.
Yeah. All right, okay. Yeah, just probably low bandwidth. Okay, thanks for that, Bob. Well, okay, the context, I guess, it seems such a long time ago now, but it's less than maybe 6 months ago, or around 6 months ago. We had our first case in Ireland of COVID-19 on the 28th of February. We had social distancing, physical distancing requirements came in on the 12th of March. I think you all probably remember 13th or 14th of March, that big announcement from the government that there will be major changes, and we all started working from home and using fantastic applications like Zoom and Teams, and that's what we have been for a lot of us for the last number of months. A lot of restrictions were in place at that time. We had 7 weeks of it going up to around May, and then there was a 5-stage plan. So at a point during that, at the end of March, we were down to 2 kilometers in terms of our restrictions in terms of travel, and a lot of other restrictions in terms of beaches and bathing areas being closed, and shops, only certain shops were allowed to be open. It seems such a long time ago, but then again, maybe we're facing something like that again, particularly here in Dublin. So we're not out of the woods yet, and of course we all fear that we may be living with COVID for quite a period of time. Next slide, Bob, please.
That's up there now.
Yes, so this is it's an image I like to use, and it's from the East Pier on 28th of March. That date's significant because that's the morning after the most severe restrictions were implemented. That's when we were down to 2 kilometers. And the East Pier, that's a very unusual image to see so few on it, and it's quite a good morning, even though it probably was quite cool, just to see maybe a handful of people on it during the morning. And just to illustrate that point, Bob, if you can move to the next slide, please. We kept records of the numbers on the piers. We had the technology anyway, but we were using it as a useful indicator or a proxy of movement within Dún Laoghaire. And as you can see, it was quite high up until the 21st, 22nd of March, and then it just plummeted. 800 people on the pier on the 28th of March. So it does illustrate a very key consideration about movement and about mobility within the county and within Dún Laoghaire in particular. And even over the next number of months, it didn't really pick up significantly. It would be now, but just really interesting. And we would also have kept records of vehicle movements as well. But we just thought this is a useful sort of microcosm of what was happening over that period of time. Next slide, Bob. I'm sure you're well aware that there was a very significant reduction in traffic during COVID. At some point during the restrictions, it was down around 25% of the pre-COVID levels. In many ways, it hasn't returned. It's probably at 70 or 80%, depending on where you are. Motorways tend to be busier, but urban roads are not as busy. And we're also seeing that the AM and PM peaks that would be associated with commuting haven't returned. And of course, that's probably down to the changes in patterns, change in work patterns in particular. We saw a particular increase in the number of people walking and cycling and using our local parks and amenities. Public transport was reduced significantly in terms of capacity, and it hasn't really recovered, which is a very worrying development. And that's not so much a physical issue, or maybe even to do with the physical distancing. I think it's a crisis of confidence with the public, and they are staying away at the moment. I hope that returns, because the alternative may mean that more people will want to drive rather than to use active modes, which we would like to see happen. And what's also really interesting from EPA monitors at the time is there was a very significant reduction in pollutants in the air, which are associated with traffic, and particularly nitrous oxides and fine particulate matter. So that was probably the silver lining of COVID as such, that we probably had a better environment for at least a short period of time. Come to recognize, what we did at the time, is that there was very much challenges for society as they reopened, businesses and workplaces. Really interesting observations on walking and cycling. More people got to know their local areas, but because there were restrictions on movement and less people were going to work, I think people were spending their time walking and cycling, exploring their local areas, exploring their parks and their amenities. And that'll be particularly relevant for us in Dún Laoghaire, because we have a lot of good parks and amenities, and people, I think, made very good use of them during the restrictions. We were seeing conflicting demands between the various users, particularly cyclists and vehicles, and trying to live with this whole idea of trying to stay 2 meters apart on what would be narrow footpaths or in public places. And all those users trying to squeeze into what was a relatively narrow public realm anyway, created additional difficulties. We're also seeing queuing on footpaths outside retail premises. That created further pinch points. We also saw during the restrictions that there were changes to the traffic signals. Some of those are being unwound now, but essentially it was to give more time to pedestrians and cyclists when they were crossing or using junctions. And that had a knock-on effect, which again hasn't been fully unwound. and it would reduce capacity at junctions. So at that time it was about 40% reduction in junction capacity, which feeds into the whole, or is part of capacity on the network generally, and it's usually junctions that have the most limiting effect. And we were looking at the road safety statistics, the provisional figures at the end of May, and seeing a significant increase in collisions, and even more worrying, a 10% increase or 9-10% increase in deaths. We also saw a doubling in the number of pedestrians who were killed on our roads across both rural and urban areas, which is a very shocking statistic when you think that if traffic levels were down at 25% and they haven't returned, other factors must be at play. And in around April, the Geraghty had a campaign against speeding on our roads, and I think there was a sense that a lot of people were using mobile phones, and indeed probably alcohol was a factor in this as well, because I think this is going to be something that's will become clearer when research is carried out afterwards. But there's quite a shocking story in there as to how road deaths increase at a time of reduced traffic movements. And so what we saw, in a way, we had a challenge. We needed new solutions. We needed to adapt, at least in the short term. We needed to safeguard public health and safety in the public areas, to respond to COVID-19, and to look at road safety risks also, and to see how that was interacting with physical distancing, because you not only had an issue of trying to avoid each other on footpaths or in public spaces, but that meant that people were going out onto the road in terms of pedestrians having to avoid other pedestrians, and cyclists possibly coming into conflict with pedestrians and vehicles, and just with the increased numbers on our roads. So what was our response to that? We set up a dedicated multidisciplinary team, and that happened around the middle of May. So this all happened in a fairly short time frame. We were probably looking at what Dublin City were doing at the time, and I guess at that time they were seen to be somewhat ahead and taking the initiative on that. Our multidisciplinary team consists of engineers, architects, other professionals. I'm a project manager, I'm a director in the local authority, but I'm also an engineer by profession. We work closely with the NTA, and they were very good, actually, and very helpful in supporting us. We had some support from engineering consultants in there. And what was really crucial is that at a very early stage, the NTA and DTAS committed to providing financial and technical support to local authorities. That was in around May, because we weren't sure how we were going to fund a lot of these interventions. And of course, the NTA have an oversight role on public transport, and so it was important for us to look at the impact of our interventions, because it wouldn't only affect cars or heavy goods vehicles, it could impact the public transport system. So we didn't really want to do anything in terms of our intervention that would make things even more difficult for public transport. Because even though capacity was down, some people were then and still are relying on it for essential travel. Maybe it's their only mode that might be open to them. So we worked with other agencies, the Geraghty, Dublin City Council, Traffic Control, and there were many others we worked with. And I think what's important to point out here, we worked very closely with our own councillors, the elected members in Delineators County Council. And this may not be that well known, but they were very supportive. Bob, if you could just go back. And we engaged with them regularly. We provided briefings probably every fortnight. We gave them detailed information. And it was a difficult situation for them, because their role in terms of their mandate and oversight was somewhat changed by what we were doing, because we were trying to move ahead in responding to a public health emergency. So we're very conscious of that. And so we felt it was very important for councillors to be given information, so that one, they'd have it, and two, that when people had queries, be it public, residents or businesses, they were able to answer those queries. And what we found too was that there was an organic demand coming from communities themselves, from particularly in villages and resident communities. They were looking for some changes to take place, and I suppose the best known case of that is in Blackrock village, where the villagers themselves actually contacted us in the first instance about making significant changes, and we worked very closely with them. Bob, if you could move on, please. Yeah, so there's essentially three pillars to our approach in DLR. When when we broke this down and analyze it. First, we looked at safety, and we knew it was really important to reallocate space for pedestrians and cyclists, one for physical distance safety. And that still remains very relevant today. I was looking at some of our projects earlier this morning in Dundrum, and we have widened footpaths there. And I'm really glad that we have, because it's something that's going to build in a level of resilience for us in our area that will allow people to move around safely and in comfort if we do have an escalation in the restrictions. We also looked at mobility. We felt that there was a need, given the crisis and the pressure on the public transport system, to shift to active modes and to focus on our towns and villages first. And we saw that as a hub and spoke layout, if you like, in that the towns and villages were the hubs, and the roads that spread out from that were the spokes, and they connected up to the other towns and villages. So we then focused on the routes between the towns and villages, and then focused on residential and suburban areas. So we moved through it in that way. And we also felt that there was an important role for us to help support the local economy, help local businesses who were really struggling, and still are in many ways, as they were reopening, particularly business in the hospitality sector, because the COVID also created restrictions for them, as we know, in terms of the capacity inside. So it was important to give them an opportunity maybe to reallocate public space where it was available. But we only did that once we had safety and mobility catered for. So there was a clear priority in terms of where space should be allocated. But oftentimes there was space over and above what was needed for safety and mobility. And we are also looking at creating safe and dynamic public spaces, and Bob will be speaking about that in more detail. And yeah, so they're the three pillars of our approach. We've actually held pretty much to those. They may have been tweaked a little bit, but it underpins everything that we're doing in terms of our COVID-19 response. So Bob, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, so the design approach is the next section, and DLR Architects, I suppose the County Council in Dún Laoghaire is lucky in that it has a significant design capacity within the County Council. There's 10 architects in the department, and then supported by additional administrative staff and so on. And our work over the last years has been, I suppose, well recognised across various fields. So we are very active in low energy housing. This is George's Place, which was well publicised, Rochestown House. And also we involve ourselves in civic and amenity work. So Dean's Grange Library, some small buildings around Sandico, but we're also very much involved in urban planning and in master planning and so on. So this is a high level sketch of proposals in Kiltiernan at the time. But we've been working for many years in the public realm, and this was our work on the metals, where we decked over the railway in Dún Laoghaire, and that was all part of an integrated strategy to reunify the waterfront and the town centre. And this was work that we carried out maybe 2 years ago in Monkstown village, which again forms part of the story of this particular mobility route. So in terms of the design approach, the coastal mobility and the county development plan. So you can see Dún Laoghaire's relationship to Dublin Centre, and you can see the red line running along. In this case, it's drawn from Dalkey, and it's stretching out to the county boundary in Buddhistown. And it's been around for quite some time, this potential for having on-road ways of moving. These were from some years ago, just some envisaging along the Queen's Road as well. So within the county development plan, there's an appendix 12, the Dún Laoghaire Urban Framework Plan, and the policy, I suppose, backing for this kind of route is set out there, and you can see it in the magenta line, which is to seek the development of pedestrian and cycle routes. It didn't quite define how that would be done or where, but I guess there was a desire to link Dún Laoghaire with the adjoining villages, to try and stimulate the adjoining villages and so on, to link them together. So you can see Blackrock, Monkstown, Dún Laoghaire, Glasthule and Dalkey. And there's an objective in the county development plan to seek and strengthen cycling and walking links between all of these different areas. In terms of the design approach, we have a particular philosophy in terms of placemaking. And I think that placemaking can sometimes become maybe a kind of a phrase which is used just to apply something as an applique to a scheme. But I mean, we look back to a lot of people like Holly White, who would have studied how these small spaces work. We continuously refer to the likes of Jan Gehl, and in the back of our mind, we're always thinking about people like Christopher Alexander and Gordon Cullen and so on, you know, these people who were very much involved in an idea that that placemaking kind of emanates really from the study of public life, and then from that observation, you can actually start creating places that people actually want to be in, and hence the little picture of the nice cafe in Italy. In other words, we have an instinctive desire to be in these kind of places that are warm and welcoming. So this is the kind of thing that we don't want to do, these very formalized kind of bleak spaces. And nor do we want to go into this kind of ideal, which was kind of vertical and horizontal segregation between pedestrians and cars and all this. This is a kind of a 1960s maybe ideal. So in our work, we try to promote this kind of a space where things are mixed and gentle and soft, and people can do lots of different things in the space. And this is a sketch, or this is a photograph from Brooklyn that the Project for Public Space is often used to illustrate, well, what's good about a sidewalk. And here you can see lots of different things, a bookshop with a very interesting displays in the window, a sidewalk that's big enough to have people doing different things, sitting, reading in different talkscapes and so on, and the little bicycle and so on. So this is kind of the way that we try to approach our work. And this is from the metals. And again, just these photographs try to illustrate that kind of soft, gentle kind of approach to public space. And again, when you have people sitting out and feeling safe, it's usually a good sign that that a public space is working. And again, this is from our metals project back in 2012. The other thing that informs the way we work is that we've participated and led an URBACT project in terms of placemaking. And this was from, I think, around 2015. And basically, it was investigating how to actually develop good practice in terms of placemaking, and actually listening and engaging in a kind of a dynamic way with the community. Okay, so out of that, there came a kind of an ideal about, you know, how to analyze the places that we find ourselves working in, different ways of reaching out and engaging with residents, how to create quick wins, for instance, and develop, say, capacity of small traders. But this philosophical background kind of feeds into the way we've approached the mobility route. And again, this is from the Project for Public Spaces, again, what makes a great place. So it means that when we do like an infrastructure project, it goes beyond just the narrow confines of infrastructure itself and considers all of those things that feed into and feed out of that to actually make a great place. So just simple things like that: they're comfortable, they can project a good image, they attract people to participate in activities there, accessible and so on. And you'll see that, I hope, illustrated in some of the photographs that we're going to show in a little bit. The other thing then is this willingness, this design squiggle concept, the willingness to engage in a kind of a dialogue without having a clear direction. Generally, we're happy to kind of let things be in slight flux until a pattern starts to emerge. So when we design, we're kind of open to different things. We're also open to iterations and to flexibility in design and flexibility in terms of the implementation. And again, this way of working feeds into the way, this dynamic model of implementation that we've actually adopted for these projects. So how do we actually, the dynamic approach to this project delivery? So if you take all of those various concepts of place and what actually makes a place, those pressures on different places, and if you put them with the filter of, say, place making and a willingness to engage, say, in terms of wicked problems and so on, and if you bring them all through that, what we've done is create this model for project delivery, which again goes through various stages of evaluating space and identifying the key issues and the key stakeholders, putting in a design that's quickly adoptive, install them almost in temporary measures, and then instigate an ongoing review and improvement. And at all stages, different stakeholders and so on can feed into that process. And then it's realized kind of through a series of like sketches and so on before it begins then to become hardened in terms of actually what's fixed down on the ground. The other key thing then was the visualizing and building support. So one of the key things we saw in the beginning was that if you actually create a vision and you illustrate it well, you can actually drive, you can actually drive, I suppose, a project and show people and make them comfortable. And they will also be comfortable because what you're doing is in many ways temporary, and it's adaptive, and it can change. So people can actually almost engage with it as a kind of a living experiment. So this was one of the first sets of sketches that we did for Blackrock. And again, it's well publicized, and we've engaged in social media and so on quite openly in terms of trying to get the message out of what we're doing. And again, lots of different sketches showing the coastal mobility route is also linked then to actually you know, the various places it's passing through, and they're strengthened by it, and activities can happen along it. And again, as it passed through Dún Laoghaire, and as it passed over to Sandy Cove. So these kind of conceptual drawings are very, very useful, I think, in any project to actually help people envisage what is actually going to be proposed. Again, when we got into Glasthule, same idea, kind of creating these images that people can relate quite quickly to. And Dalkey, going through various sketches. So again, a really useful way of actually engaging in this process is actually to produce these kind of drawings. And again, describing materials and concepts and what it could look like and so on. So I'm going to hand over to Conor, who is going to talk about the actual on-site delivery.
Thank you, Bob, and good evening, everybody. So my section is relating to the pace of delivery, and when we got to the point of getting to site, what we actually did and how quickly it could be delivered. That's just a kind of an overview map of the 5 sections of the route, and we were conscious that there was such a latent demand backed up by the various counters along the coast that there was a huge potential for people to cycle, and the idea was that we would try to deliver the route as quickly as possible. As you look at those numbers, 2 and 3 actually had existing facilities, so the plan was we would start with section 1 and we'd skip over to 4 and 5 and get it up and running as quickly as we could. So we had identified quite early on that if it was going to be suitable for all ages, it had to be segregated, and the curb that we wanted to use, the temporary curb, wasn't available. There was just such a demand for it all over Europe. So we had to find an alternative that was dynamic, that could be easily changed, that was obviously available to us, could be installed quickly, and provided that segregation. So we settled on a timber curb that the contractor we had at the time actually produced themselves. And then it had to work in the kind of heritage context that we were going to use it. And we painted it suitable colors, that it wasn't like a standard piece of traffic kit. So just to talk through the first week, and this photograph is section 1, day 1 at 10 a.m. So at this stage in the day, they had dropped the cones all along the center line of section 1, which was about 700 meters long. And at 10 o'clock, the lights were switched and the no entry sign was put up. So essentially that first 700 meters of space was secured, and it was available to people if they would choose to cycle or walk in it. And that's essentially how quickly you can secure space if you're using, say, a half a road. So at 11 o'clock on day 1, the truck with the curbing arrives. So that represents about 400 meters of curbing, which is about how much they can lay in a day. So you can provide segregation at that pace along a center line of a road. And you can see that there's kind of feet on that piece of timber, so it doesn't affect any of the drainage. By the 4 o'clock on day 1, the entire section 1 had been cleaned and swept, and the road markings had been removed. And on the right hand side in that picture, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but the parking bay that was previously beside the curb was now out, which is going to be on the outside of the cycle track, and the residents were beginning to use it. So during day 2, the curbing continued, and it was installed all the way along the route as far as the end of section 1. Day 3, any temporary cones that had been used were being re-picked up so that they could be used section 4 and 5 the following week, and any bollards that were left or any bollards that were required were being replaced by more bolted down bollards. And there's bollards in this section versus the other sections because obviously there's parking, and they have to have gaps in the bollards so people can come in and out through them rather than having to step over a curb. And just to say as well, if you're ever doing this, that you set the bollards out at the wheelbase of the car so they don't obviously open car doors into a bollard. So Thursday to Saturday, then it was laying of anti-skid. So this became our limiting factor in the pace of our progress, that they could lay 3 meters wide by about 200 meters a day of anti-skid in the one that they had. So by Saturday on the first week, section 1 had been lined, anti-skidded and protected up as far, and hasn't really changed since that first week. So just to talk a little bit about the materials and how dynamic they are, I'd say on half of my time in the first few weeks was meeting different residence groups and talking to people about how the route was operating. And this is quite a good example of a situation where, even though the auto track says that somebody in a large vehicle can get out through this gap easily, that there was an issue. This particular resident had quite a large vehicle that had very, very poor steering capacity on it. And their issue was that no matter how hard they tried, and they genuinely did try, but they couldn't get in and out through the gate. So what we were able to do is we just widened the gap by, say, a meter on one side, and the carpenter came down, he brought a saw with him, he cut a section of the curb off and rebolted it. It took about 15 minutes. And I suppose that's how dynamic it is, and how the ability that we have to respond to sort of local issues. If that had been, say, a 50 Newton concrete curb, to change it, that stage is impossible. There were situations where residents asked for something to be moved by 200 or 300 mil, which obviously they felt was important, even though it may not have given them actual more space, but we could accommodate those sorts of requests as well and try and bring people with us. Some other issues we encountered, and hopefully this video is playing, but this particular resident always reversed out of their entrance, and the lane now was slightly narrower, and they was kind of further compounded by the angle of their driveway and the width of the gate, and they struggled to get out the way that they previously did. And one thing that we were able to do was we brought our traffic management guys down, and we held the cars back 200 or 300 meters down the road for a few minutes, and we worked with the resident to try reversing in. And that particular resident had lived there for more than 30 years and never reversed into the driveway, but that was something that, you know, with a bit of practice, they were able to do something slightly different that worked for them. One of the questions we get asked quite a bit is about a one-way system and emergency vehicles and their ability to respond. And I've actually witnessed where emergency services have responded to incidents along the coast. So this particular one was obviously a fire, and 3 units of the fire brigade attended the scene, and the first 2 came down at the junction, and the third guy waited, and he diverted all the cars away, and the other 2 came down and put the fire out, and it lasted about 30 or 40 minutes, and there was no issue. And you can see in the top photograph that actually the fire tender fits within the cycle lane. So if there was congestion on the road, they could use the cycle lane to travel up and down the route. And obviously cyclists have the ability to just move out of the way quite quickly and turn themselves into pedestrians if needed to get out of it. The other incident was related to a pedestrian that had fallen, and an ambulance and a Garda vehicle attended, and again, they had no issue. So this is just a snapshot of photographs that were taken by the team, and these are very normal pictures. This could all be seen on any one trip down the coastal route, where there's a huge amount of young kids, users of all ages and abilities, and I wouldn't see this as being very unusual, whereas maybe 6 or 8 months ago this would have been the exception. It's just a little, and hopefully this video again plays here. There's something just to point out, especially when you're designed for children, that generally with roads, the crossfall on a road is about 2.5%, which is quite steep. And anybody that has children, when you see them trying to walk on a footpath for the first time, they struggle to deal with crossfall, and there is a little bit of a wobble when they're trying to maneuver the crossfall. But in this situation, you can see that the cars are quite a bit away from the curb, so that gives an element of forgiveness on the roadside, that the cars generally stay away from the curb. Whereas on our route, there is a section on the right there where we have a section of 2-way, and that's quite relevant for people that may have 9-meter wide roads and would be considering, say, a 3-meter 2-way cycle track and a 6-meter 2-way road, in that the cars have choice. And in this situation, obviously, if there is a wobble and there was contact with the curb, obviously that level of forgiveness is no longer there. So that sort of brings us along to the wave delineators that we've used. And in this case, originally when we got these, they were used to announce the public spaces, and we were planning to use them at the seating areas as a sort of to highlight them. But when we noticed, obviously, the cars passing much closer to the curb, that they were brought in here to try and introduce an element of forgiveness on the cyclist side. So the cyclist tends to stay more towards the centre line, even though they have the space, and the cars tend to drive past them slower because the perception that this is a vertical barrier. And you'll notice there from these two kids that they're lower than the handlebars. So even if they had to pass close to them, that there isn't any issue with them colliding with them. So that's all I have, and I'll hand you back to Bob.
Okay, so Conor has begun to show, I suppose, the range of users that are using the route, and I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to rattle through this quite quickly. We have a mobility route for lots of different users, but it is primarily a route for mobility. Along it, we try to create these areas to embed the idea of accessibility and going along this route. So you can see we've created these small areas, and this one relates to the village in Glasthule, so that people can actually come out of the village and enjoy the coastal route and take say a coffee out of the village and sit out beside the sea. So it kind of enlivens the experience of the mobility route as you go along. Similarly, we've just created these small little pockets where people can stop and enjoy and come off the route if required, because we're finding also a lot of people are walking as well along this, as well as cycling, can stop and can just sit and take in the views. And again, as you come towards Sandy Cove, what used to be just a small concrete inset with parking is now turned into a small parklet where people can relax and have a picnic. Just in terms of supporting the local economy, for instance, this is a photograph from Blackrock, and it just tries to pick out the various pieces of some of the work, and it's kind of really maybe referring back to that Brooklyn slide, where you're kind of combining, say, people having coffee with apple trees. You've got native meadow planters planting in set into planters, which people can use for informal seating. And then you've just got areas where people can just prop their bicycles, and that's then right beside the counterflow in Blackrock Village itself. And again, when you look at it from a different angle, you've got public seating on the other side of the road. You've got areas where the traders can put out their own seating to kind of lend a personalized character to the street, and then a segregated cycling and protect it again from the adjoining carriageway. And what we've tried to do across all of the work and all of the villages along this line is to use a kind of a common language so that thematically everything begins to get stitched together. And again, the sum of all of these things working together is really great, you know. Again, back into the detail. Again, I'm making the point that placemaking is not just about kind of distributing bits and bobs around the place. It is thought through from first principles and worked through into detail. So we are keen to use native Irish meadow planting, and actually that's really coming out quite nicely now. And again, putting in apple trees again is a kind of a thematic thing. And also putting out lots and lots of public seating, places where people can eat is always a great way of animating public space. And you'll see the boxes here were unpainted because the moment they went in and the picnic tables went down, people immediately migrated that morning onto them. So in Glasthule Village, again, the same ideas, again, the same kind of furniture, the same kind of elements. In Glasthule, then we changed from the meadow planting to herb planting, again, to reflect as a kind of a local store, Caviston's, and 64 wines. So there's a lot of kind of food-based outlets in Glasthule, so I was to try and actually capitalize on that. And again, safe queuing areas, back to this idea that a lot of this is to support businesses, but it's also to make public areas safer, where there's more space where people can actually stand apart. And again, putting out public eating and sitting areas. Okay, so so Robert is going to talk about the process now of evaluation.
Okay. Thanks for that, Bob. If you wouldn't mind just going through the slides, might make things easier. Okay, I guess probably useful to sort of liven up the presentation, even with some of the tweets that go out. I try to communicate regularly about the projects, let people know what's happening. And I guess at other times I'm trying to put forward my own views on certain things, or a philosophy, if you like. But on this, I'm just going to go through the evaluation side of things. So we're looking at how do we understand the impact of what's been completed? How will we try and measure that? How can we do that in terms of numbers? quantitatively, and how can we do it in the less tangible way, be that qualitatively. So, and I need a range of things. So just to illustrate that point, and this is a fairly straightforward concept, but the numbers on the mobility route only tell us part of the story. The real story really is the diversity and the range of users on the mobility route. The young, the old, people with disabilities, people who haven't cycled in a long time and coming back to cycling. So there's another story going on there that the numbers, just the plain data won't tell you. And just on that, we have seen, and we have cycle counters in place now, permanent cycle counters in place on the coastal route. And it also counts pedestrians, but at 3 different locations. And that's actually now from, I think, 2 weeks ago. But last weekend we saw over 5,000 people on it at the People's Park counter. So the numbers there, and there was an error in the tweet that I sent out about a week and a half ago. That was 130%. But if we look at the 5,500, I mean, it's what, 3-fold increase. So it's very significant. And I think if we just look at the Sunday, that can give us a skewed view. We need to look at the weekly figures, and we're starting to build up a base of data now that will give us an evidence base to allow us to carry out further analysis. But it's 17,000 cyclists on that route per week. And that's really important because I'm very keen to emphasize that this is a transport route. This is a mobility route in the true sense. It's not a leisure cycleway. It's not a greenway. Fine if people want to use it in that sense and come and visit Dún Laoghaire at the weekend, or people locals, but it is a transport corridor. When you see it during the week when kids are going to school, or people going to work, or people going for appointments, that's really when it comes into its own. Bob, can you just pass that on? Yeah. So I think it's fair to say we have a low evidence base when it comes to mobility interventions in Ireland. We don't really know the impact of what those interventions has been. Has it been positive? Has it been negative? And when you have a situation like that, where there's a low evidence base within Ireland, we may have evidence from the UK or from Europe, it creates a vacuum. It creates the possibility for speculation and for myth and for rumour and for theories to be expounded that don't have an evidence base. So it's really critical that when we're carrying out these interventions, one, we try and understand them and evaluate them and have that done independently. And 2 is, it's not just for us. We're hoping that if we can carry out the evaluation on these projects, it'll help inform whether they become permanent or not, but it'll also help other local authorities, other public bodies that are carrying out similar work. They will be able to use these studies as a basis. And I accept that the report will show that there are things that we could have done better as well. So there's an element of learning lessons from this. Maybe our model could be changed. Maybe some elements of engagement, for example, we could have done differently. So I think the independent element of this is really important, and really happy that Technological University Dublin are on board with us, and their School of Transport Engineering and Environment. So very good people there, Sarah Rock, David O'Connor, and Lorraine Fitzsimons, and they're doing really good work. So our study will look at, the study by TU will look at all of our interventions. So it will include the mobility route, but also Blackrock, Dundrum, Dalkey, Glasthule. And we want to know what the impact is across a range of criteria. The first phase is Blackrock on the coastal mobility route, because we'd like to move ahead on that quite quickly. And we're hoping that it'll be completed in about 3 to 6 months. So TU Dublin have already started their work, and we're finalising the scope of that assessment with them. So if you could just go on to the next slide, Bob. Okay, so this is something we won't be sharing after this, but this just gives you a snapshot of what TU Dublin might be looking at, and that's under 4 different criteria. So we're not just looking at purely mobility, we're looking at the social impact of what we're doing, the economic impact, and also the process and delivery. So how did we do our work? Was our model good or not? How do we engage with people, and so on? And we probably will add other criteria to that, including environmental, to do with air pollution, and to do with health as well. and there may be other criteria, but it's important just to give a sense that we are looking at this in quite a holistic way, and that's really important because we just don't want a situation where maybe the person who's shouting loudest is going to be the person that will be heard. So, for example, we have things like stakeholder surveys and resident surveys where we'll be using a statistical approach and looking at representative samples so that we can get a more rounded view of what the impact has been. We'll also be looking at interviewing, or TU Dublin will be interviewing traders to see what their experience has been and to get a sense of that. Bob, if you could pass that on. So that's really it from us this evening. We're happy to answer questions, but I'd just like to thank Bob. I think Bob was the person who probably put most of this together, so I appreciate that, and Conor as well for his contribution. And just to point out, while the three of us are here today, or this evening, representing on this, we have a large team in DLR, and a really good team, and I've said it before, I'm very proud of them, and so is the local authority. And we're learning all the time, and it's been a really, really sharp learning curve for us over the last number of months. So look, thank you for your attention, and I'll pass you back probably to Sheila now, and happy to answer questions.
Great. Okay, thanks a million. There's loads of questions coming in, and we have a few questions ourselves. So I'm going to ask to keep the answers probably a little bit more concise, because I know we're stuck for time and we don't want to delay everyone. So there's a couple of particularly specific to the project and ones that would invite wider discussion. So I might, whoever wants to jump in with the answers, they're more than welcome to. Okay, so a few very quick questions. How did you record the pedestrian numbers on the East Pier?
Okay, we're going to have to divulge some of our secrets here, are we?
Yeah. Scoop for better Ennis, thank you.
Yeah, well, it was fully GDPR compliant. That's the first thing I'm going to say.
Great.
Important. We have technology that counts footfall on the East Pier, and it's tied in with a CCTV element. Okay, but as I said, it's fully compliant, and we use that solely to get a sense of the numbers that are on the pier, because we actually needed to do it from a safety perspective as well. We were monitoring that when there was high numbers and a very acute awareness of the need for social distancing. So yeah, so we have footfall counters on CCTV, and that collects the data for us.
Okay, great. And the wave delineators, you might have seen it in one or two of the photos there, the choice to use those on that particular stretch, if Conor Geraghty could take that one, and where they sourced.
Yeah, they're sourced from civic.ie. They're a supplier. They generally do traffic signal equipment, but they also do the wave delineators. The choice to use them on that particular was because of that was the only section that was two-way, and obviously it gives that element of forgiveness in the cycling side, which obviously is important along that section. Right,
and for Bob, possibly. So one of the things I love about the mobility route was how elegant it looked. And obviously that comes into the creative side of things. Can you talk about the palette of colours that was used?
Okay, so I think early on the decision, but there was a drive to ensure that these emergency measures didn't end up covering all the villages and the roads with the kind of infrastructure that you'd normally associate with traffic. So different types of cones and bollards and wands and orcas and all of that kind of stuff. So we tried to integrate them all into one palette. And we had previously used anti-skid and this kind of surfacing in different projects, and the tone and so on has worked very well in heritage areas. So it's actually quite a muted way of making these interventions, but still making them work with the kind of context that we're working with.
Yeah, and again on the placemaking aspect, and I know is that, you know, for open spaces, and a question came in there about, you know, people drinking on an open pier, or and I guess this falls back to people attract people. Can you speak to that fear, I guess, that it might be used in a way that makes others might feel a bit uncomfortable?
Well, generally what we found is that when you put out seating and benches and so on, it does attract people, but it attracts a greater diversity of people. And then areas become kind of self-policing in a way. Like we live in an open society where everybody they find their place. But what we find is that when you put out and make areas more friendly, you get more people who are responsible and just enjoying those kind of spaces. So, so that's really our experience. There are of course, and this is always part of the evaluation and the observation, there's going to be always issues that do need to be looked at and observed and teased through. But generally, that's the experience. Yeah,
and so we're very much talking about an urban setting and connecting those villages along the coast. Do you feel, and anyone who's welcome to take this question, that the same principles apply when we come to rural settings? We have a lot of people here from around the country, and they may not. Yeah, if you could speak to that. Yeah.
Okay, so I suppose with Robert and Conor, we've looked at, say, the interconnection between, say, our rural villages. Dún Laoghaire has a very strong coastline, but it also has a very strong area in the mountains. That's why it's from the mountains to the sea. So we have these rural villages, Glencullen, Kiltiernan, Sandyford, and so on. And they're connected in the traditional way by normal roads. But it is something that we're looking at. How can you actually have normal day-to-day active mobility interconnecting those villages? And again, I suppose there are lessons to be learned from the coastal mobility route in terms of how you actually might make those kind of same places that people actually want to use and feel comfortable on. You know? So that is under active consideration.
And Stepaside is one of those villages, right?
Correct.
Yeah, which is the perfect name for a village to physically distance. So DLR, the in-house resources seem to be fantastic, right? So there's like 10 architects. So and you might consider this, like a lot of local authorities around the country may not even have an architecture department. And it's very obvious from what you're talking about is the need for multidisciplinary teams and the need to kind of break down silos that may have existed. So I guess if you were to consider how best to roll out a network of active travel networks across the country, are there certain things that you would say are absolute or nice to have or critical, or what's your input into that?
I think that in terms of active mobility rollout and so on, I think that first and foremost, people in their own area and know their area best. So in terms of the evolution of those, it's certainly coming up from people who know the locality, and that's both the executive and the professionals, and also the community. Of course, there will be standards, but again, it's really working with what you have. And I suppose that refers back to the models that we were showing in terms of how do you analyze and consider place, and of course then, you know, national standards and stuff are a critical part of feeding into all of that. But in terms of place analysis and so on, I think you start by really considering, you know, your locality and working back from that.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like we can talk about standards and guidelines, but really that misses out on the creative aspect of that design from the very beginning, like the squiggle and the consideration of place and the consideration of local community, right? So yeah, the multidisciplinary aspect of it really stood out for me.
I might just come in on that.
Yeah.
Because what's really critical is on this, and what we've tried to blend together is the idea of function and the aesthetic. It still needs to serve the function first. If you have active mobility infrastructure, let's call it what it is, if we have footpaths and cycle lanes. We need to demystify, the language sometimes is a bit cloudy. So we need footpaths and we need cycle lanes. The question is, and you ask, can this be rolled out everywhere? Even in DLR, where we're trying to make progress here, it's quite a challenge for us. And there's a lot of different factors that help us in it, but there are factors that are making it quite difficult, and that's going to be replicated across the country. I think you have to look at the driver. Why has it happened now? What's making it happen now? If you look at what's happened in terms of an international experience in the Netherlands or Denmark, in the Netherlands it was to do with serious road safety issues and child fatalities and stopped their kindermort. In Denmark, in or around the same time, it was to do with a response to an energy crisis. So what is the driver in Ireland? Is it going to be a response to climate change or the need for climate mitigation? Is it going to be a response to the COVID pandemic? Is it going to be a response to policy changes at a government level, requiring local authorities or communities to implement these? Or is it going to come organically from communities themselves who will want this because they'll see it as maybe a safer way to live or a lifestyle choice? And I think this is where you start to see things like mobility start to interact with livability. The two of them are synonymous. They have to come together, because we can't design a mobility infrastructure unless we know where we're going and why we're going there. And sometimes we're designing very expansive mobility infrastructure because land use planning is forcing us into that way. So it's going to be a real challenge in the rural setting and in villages because of the settlement patterns. Many people live outside of their towns and villages, and you'd have to say that that's going to be quite challenging, but maybe mobility infrastructure within villages is something that can be achieved, but maybe on a more limited scale.
And you mentioned there at a national level, was there a legislative provision under which this scheme was implemented?
Well, there was government guidance that came through the Department of Transport and Department of Planning and Local Government, and it came through the Design Manual for Urban Roads and Streets, or DMURS, which would be commonly referred to. So there was an interim advice note, and that set the basis, if you like, in terms of government guidelines. Behind all that, there is legislation in place. There are a number of provisions on the road traffic legislation and on the planning legislation that allow local authorities to use their executive powers to implement these. So they didn't necessarily need to use Part A planning process, for example, or they weren't required to get the vote of the elected members. Those powers were there for the executive to use if they wish. It would have been a matter for executives to bring that before their elected members for their review or for a vote, but there wasn't a requirement for that.
Right. And actually, is there anything that you could see maybe in other jurisdictions that might be of use from the legislative point of view that might help in rolling out similar temporary interventions to be trialled?
Yeah, I think there are a number of examples, and not very far away either. The experimental traffic orders in the UK are very useful, something we've been looking at. They've been used for the low traffic neighbourhoods there. I think it could be something that would be very useful to us because it would give the local authorities or public bodies an opportunity to try something different, but with the legislative protection.
Yeah.
At the moment, we don't have a legislative protection, and that could say for 6 months, we'll trial this, we'll evaluate as we go, and we'll evaluate it at the end, and then we'll keep it or we won't, or we'll change it. But we don't have that at the moment, and I think it would be very useful if we did have something like that. Yeah.
And you mentioned there the evaluation, which is very heartening to see how in-depth it is. It isn't simply traffic counters. It's the qualitative aspect and the business aspect, you know, the health aspect, that it's very, I guess it's very in-depth. And that data will be massively useful, not just to you, but many local authorities around the country. So was there anything and this is for each of you, but was there anything in particular that surprised you in the process of the design and rollout, or the talk around the project, or any aspect that just you went, that's either good or challenging?
Maybe that's one for Conor, isn't it?
Yeah.
All of you, I say.
Yeah.
Well, it's how quickly people engage with it and how quickly they change their habits. I mean, it was from the first day we dropped the first cone, it's like trying to hold back water, that people were appearing from side roads and they just wanted to get into that space, and they had the desire to use the road to go out with their kids or their families, and we were giving them the opportunity for that. So it's when you travel down the route, like if you're ever struggling a day in work, it's easy to go down on the coast and see all the families with their small children on it, to just highlight that this is the right thing to do in this location.
Yeah.
I think just the diversity across the route has been so surprising. It's actually quite difficult to travel the route now because you're meeting people that you know, and it's quite social as well.
Right. Well, there must be a huge sense of professional pride as well.
But it's good. It was great to be involved. I mean, it's there aren't many projects like this in anybody's career that you get to the opportunity to do something like this, and it's been great.
Yeah. And Bob,
nice to keep going.
Yeah, Bob or Robert?
I think,
Anything
like
that
for me,
surprised
I think what was most heartening was the way that people would engage with what we were doing, and come out and meet us on the side of the road, early morning, all sorts of different meetings, and we've all been on the ground continuously meeting different people, working around issues, working through issues, and so on. So the people were people. And this goes along the mobility route and also into Blackrock Village and Glasthule and so on. People are very engaged with their locality, and actually I think that's really, really heartening. You know, it wasn't difficult to find people to talk to.
Yeah. And Robert, you, or are you?
I guess what was really interesting for me is that how perceptions before something is put in place change very radically once it's actually in place. So, for example, when you look at a design, and one of the things we would have been told about is cyclists will be speeding up along the route, they'll be going at 25, 30 kilometers per hour in lycra and knocking people over like bowling pins. And of course, the reality is very, very different. 15 to 20 kilometers is the speed, lots of families that are there. And we also had people saying, well, you need to put up lots of signage and tell fast cyclists to go slow and all of this kind of thing. And in the end, what you find is that people are quite sensible. They self-regulate, they can mix quite easily with pedestrians and cyclists. And I think what we're seeing in the statistics already is that the presence of the cycle route is creating a much happier and pleasant environment for pedestrians. It's easier for them to walk alongside a cycle route than it is alongside a traffic or a road with moving traffic.
And I saw there that you did a kind of real world audit with Cycling Without Age. Could you talk to the feedback that you got on that?
Well, it's about engaging with users across a range of areas, and yeah, it's been really interesting working with people who have mobility issues, people who are using the route in a different way than was imagined, and that's also a really interesting aspect, because again, it's not just about bicycles. It's we have trikes, we have trishaws, we have wheelchairs using the route, and so yeah, it's been interesting. And I guess for me, I need to learn more about it. I didn't know that much. I need to understand the challenges that they might have. They're larger devices, so they have they don't turn as easily. They don't get through the entrances in the same way, or access points. So we have to be mindful of that and try and build an infrastructure that's as inclusive as it can be. There'll always be limitations, but I think by working with people and understanding their concerns, you have the best chance of actually achieving that.
Yeah. And okay, we're going to finish up shortly, but I just have maybe one or two more questions. What extent did the interventions you introduced come from existing plans that were either well advanced or maybe just an idea? Like, was it a blank page, or how advanced were they?
I suppose they were more in the realm of ideas and possibilities, concepts to be explored and opportunities to be explored, and that's kind of embedded in our county development plan, where it does talk about this area as having the potential to strengthen cycling and pedestrian links between various areas. But it wasn't really much beyond that, you know. Nothing was worked out in detail, and the Sandycove to Sutton as an initiative is still a live project. So so really, I would say that whilst we had an idea, and we're also aware that lots of other people were having similar ideas, like social media was full of mock-ups of what could happen and so on. So I think maybe a lot of people were coming to a similar kind of idea at the same time. So it was one of those kind of moments of serendipity. Yeah.
And do you feel that the project reflects a culture of innovation within the council?
I think that the council, I think Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown is actually quite strong in terms of innovation. And actually, I mean, my own experience in that would be, I suppose, the role that we play in, say, low energy housing and so on. So we've really been at the forefront of progressing that. I wouldn't answer for Conor and Robert, but I think I think we certainly are an innovative council.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to finish up on this one. If you each of you had one piece of advice, okay, and remember our attendees are very multidisciplinary. So it's health, architecture, engineering, advocacy, governance, government, research. If there's one piece of advice that you would give them that you've kind of learned or you would like to pass on, what would that be?
Robert, do you want to take that one?
Okay, I'll start. I think what I'd say is just don't be afraid. It is okay to take a risk, not a reckless risk. We don't know everything. And I think what we can do is we can design a model that allows us to be dynamic, to get most of the things in place, then find a way to improve them as we go. So I think we need to encourage people who want to try, who want to take risks. And one of the things I would say, and this is a really important point, because I hope there's colleagues in local authorities listening or in public bodies. I wouldn't pay too much attention to criticism that's out there, be it on social media or in other areas. I would say if you feel you can go ahead, if you can build an alliance locally, if you have the will locally, proceed with it. And even a setback shouldn't be the end of things. It's just a setback. Just continue on. That'll be my advice anyway.
That sounds pretty cool. And Bob or Conor?
I suppose from my perspective, something that's been very different in this project, other projects, is the flexibility and the kind of dynamic approach to, well, we should get out and try something and then adjust it until it works for the people that it affects. And that's very, I suppose, different from a traditional engineering approach. We would come in with concrete and tar day one, and once you get to that point, it's fixed. Whereas I think the delivery of these and the pace that you could deliver 300 or 400 meters, you know, in a couple of days, see how that goes, work it around, and then when it works for everybody, you know what you're getting, and then ask people, is this what it is? So you're not constantly fighting the status quo, whether it should be there. You're saying, well, did it work for you or did it not? And if it didn't, can we look at something slightly different that would work for everybody?
Yeah. And Bob?
So I think one of the things that I certainly enjoyed, and maybe was slightly unusual, was that a lot of us working on these projects projected a very public face. So we were actually, and that's kind of maybe sometimes unusual.
Yeah. That's how we tracked you down.
Huh? Yes,
that's how we tracked you down.
Yeah, but so we actually, I suppose, were content to be visible and to be maybe associated and visible faces of the project. And actually, I think that helps humanize it, and it helps embed that kind of idea of a kind of a dynamic way of working on a project, you know, and it builds up much greater levels of trust. And I think that's a real good takeaway from this kind of project.
Yeah, and I think it really does help with level of trust and transparency, and the greater transparency, the greater the trust, and people are more likely to engage, I suspect, so that there is that kind of makes it nearly richer community engagement with you. so that you get richer insights from that if people do trust and everyone's working together, and that's really obvious. Okay, that's it. I think we've gone way over the time. Thank you very, very much to Robert Burns, Bob Hannan and Conor Geraghty, Galway man. We appreciate that you took time out to share your work, and we appreciate you, the attendees, for hearing their work. So we're going to leave you on this note. Get something done rather than nothing at all, but aim for the possible. Be inspired and be brave. Thank you.